why is the Donbas so important to Russia and indeed to Ukraine? Gabriel Gavin is a journalist based in Georgia who's written extensively about the region. Gabriel, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's consider Russia's change of focus then to this particular region of Ukraine. And I suppose it's worth putting it in its context, is it not? Because this focus from Russia is now on a part of the country where they have held some influence since 2014, in the east of the country, I mean.
Yeah, so since 2014, Russian-backed proxies have controlled Donetsk and Lugansk, but only around kind of 40, 50, 60% of the territory of those two oblasts, of those two regions. And for a long time, the Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk were saying, well, we should have the control over all of the region that was administratively belonged to us during our time as a former part of Ukraine. And when Vladimir Putin decided to recognize these two breakaway statelets as sovereign nations, becoming the only country in the world to do so, he effectively recognized them within their proclaimed borders. So he said, well, we'll take your word on what territory you want. And so it's become very clear that actually if Russia can't deliver its main military objectives, which were capturing Kyiv, which were changing the government in Ukraine, which were effectively bringing the nation to heel and preventing it from living out its ambitions to join the EU and NATO, what it can do potentially is push the red lines that have existed since 2014 further and further towards the West. And in doing so, it can claim a propaganda victory. It can say, well, look, we're protecting ethnic Russians who live in these regions who since 2014 have faced, shelling or whatever else in the exchange of fire that we've had with Kyiv's forces. So it becomes the kind of crunch issue of the entire war. And I think the battle for the Donbas is basically a microcosm of all the tensions that are raging at the moment, all the war, and effectively the fate, I think, of this entire conflict will be settled in the Donbas.
It's really interesting to consider that because in terms of the overall military, outlook, whether there is victory imminent for Russia, if that comes in this area, is that because they have been militarily more successful, or is it simply because they've intensified their focus on a much smaller area than in the initial weeks of the war?
Yeah, well, it's definitely the latter. So at the start of the so-called special operation, you had this huge front opening from Belarus in the north all the way down to Crimea in the south. You had effectively a war on three sides. And very few countries, the US and UK being maybe among the exceptions to this, could sustain such a massive frontier in any kind of operation where you have to get tanks and troops and logistics supply lines across. Effectively, it's reminiscent of something from World War II. And the only reason that they seem to have done that was because they thought the Ukrainian defenders would crumble. And they packed it off, these guys, according to a great many reports, with 3 days worth of rations in their parade uniforms, saying, don't worry, you'll be welcomed as heroes. And that's obviously been the absolute opposite of what's turned out to be true. And instead, what they've had to do is they've had to entirely rethink their strategy. They've had to focus not on this massive grand battle plan, but on individual tactical captures, so Severodonetsk being one of them. And in fact, what they've had to do is effectively reorganize their entire military command, putting their forces under the control of General Alexander Dvornikov, who had some successes, quote unquote, in the Syrian civil war. And what we're going to see, I think, is much more of this playbook where Russian troops move up to a city or a settlement, they bombard it into basically submission, and then they try and go in and claim the ruins. And I mean, whether they can call that liberation, I think, comes up to how successful their propaganda is after the conflict.
And so then, from a Ukrainian viewpoint, when it comes to the Donbas region, is it space that's worth giving up in order to buy time in the kind of longer term outlook in this war?
I don't think there's any appetite in Kyiv for any kind of settlement that gives up any territory. And that includes the Donbass, that includes Crimea as well. Because I think if you're a Ukrainian official, or you're a Ukrainian soldier, or you're a Ukrainian, your husband, your father, your brother is serving, I think you think we're making tactical victories. We are doing everything we can to defend our homeland. any deal that we did with Russia, we can't trust Moscow, we can't trust Putin not to renege on it. So if we give up the Donbas, if we give up Crimea, the thinking goes, well, what's to stop another assault in 3 months' time, or 3 years' time, or 30 years' time? So I think the current feeling in Kiev, and certainly from the Ukrainians I've spoken to, is very much one of, we have to win this existential battle for the soul of our very nation and to defend Europe.
Yeah.
And so it's almost impossible to see what kind of peace deal could be done between Putin and Zelensky. It's just not it doesn't feel like the two would have any common ground on which to base any kind of compromise.
Gabriel, it's really good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Gabriel Gavin, a journalist based in Georgia who's written extensively about the Donbas region of Ukraine.